The remote village and the haunted scholar nestled deep within a forgotten corner of the world. The village of Elden Hollow lay shrouded in perpetual mist, its crooked buildings huddled together as if in fear of the unseen. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, the wind howling through the narrow streets like a whisper from something ancient and unfathomable. The village had long been abandoned, save for the occasional wandering soul who sought refuge from the world beyond its crumbling walls. But to those who knew the truth, Elden Hollow was not merely a place of ruin. It was a sanctuary for the forgotten, a threshold between the known and the unknowable. At the heart of this desolate place stood an old, weathered house, its once proud facade now a patchwork of rot and time. It was here that the protagonist, a scholar named Elias Varn, had come. Varn had spent years poring over forgotten texts, chasing the echoes of the old ones, the entities that lurked beyond the veil of human comprehension. His obsession had led him to the fringes of the world, to places where the sun never shone and the stars seemed to watch with silent, knowing eyes. Now, standing before the decaying structure, he felt the weight of something unseen pressing against his mind, a presence that had been waiting for him. The village had always been a place of whispers, of stories passed down in hushed tones by those who had seen things that should not be seen. Varn had heard the tales before, of the old ones who had once walked the earth, of the cult that had worshipped them, and of the madness that had followed. But he had not believed them, not until now. As he stepped through the threshold of the house, the air grew colder. The walls seemed to breathe, and the shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden beams and the distant sound of something moving in the darkness beyond the window. Varn had come seeking knowledge, but now he felt something else, a presence, vast and unknowable, pressing against the edges of his mind. It was not yet clear what had drawn him here, but he knew that whatever awaited him in Elden Hollow would change him forever. The village, the house, the air itself, all of it was part of something far greater, something that had been waiting for him to return. One is Varn of the Solianizations, of academia, a man of the unknown, unearthing the unknown, Tahat had been his life unearthing the past. His early years had been his life unearthing the hallowed halls of academia, where he had studied the myths of old, the fragmented accounts of civilizations that had vanished without a trace. But it was not until he had stumbled upon a single, tattered manuscript, one that spoke of the old ones, that his life had changed irrevocably. The text had been a revelation, a glimpse into a world beyond the veil of human understanding. And from that moment on, Varn had been consumed by a singular obsession to uncover the truth of the old ones, to understand the forces that had shaped the world before mankind had even walked upon it. His descent into madness had been slow, almost imperceptible at first. He had begun to see patterns in the ancient texts that others had overlooked, connections that hinted at a deeper, more terrible truth. The old ones were not merely the stuff of myth. They were real, and they had once walked among men. But something had happened to them, something that had driven them into the abyss, leaving only whispers and warnings in their wake. Varn had spent years searching for more, following the trail of forgotten knowledge, uncovering the remnants of ancient cults that had worshipped the old ones in secret. He had come to believe that the old ones had not been destroyed, but merely hidden, waiting for the right moment to return. Yet, despite all his knowledge, Varn had always felt the weight of something unseen pressing against his mind. It was not fear, not exactly, but a sense of inevitability, as though the old ones were watching him, waiting for him to take the final step. He had tried to convince himself that he was merely chasing the truth, that his obsession was not madness, but a calling. But the more he delved into the past, the more he felt the presence of something vast and unknowable, something that had been waiting for him. His return to Elden Hollow was not a coincidence. He had followed the trail of the old ones, the fragmented accounts of the cult that had once worshipped them, and the strange symbols that had appeared in the village's forgotten corners. He had come seeking answers, but he had not expected to find something else, something that would change him forever. And as he stood in the cold, dimly lit house, he could not shake the feeling that he was not the one who had come to Elden Hollow. Rather, it was the old ones who had been waiting for him. The ancient text and the forbidden knowledge. Varn's fingers trembled as they traced the brittle edges of the parchment, the ancient text lying before him like a forgotten whisper from a time long past. The pages were yellowed with age, their ink faded, but still legible, as if the words themselves had been etched into the very fabric of the world. He had found the text buried beneath layers of dust and decay in the attic of the old house, hidden behind a crumbling shelf that had long since collapsed into the floor. It had been a discovery that should have been impossible. No record of such a manuscript had ever existed in any known archive, and yet here it was, as if it had been waiting for him. The symbols that adorned the text were unlike anything Varn had ever encountered. They were not mere letters or script, but intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked at them too long. Some of the shapes bore an uncanny resemblance to the sigils he had seen in the fragmented accounts of the old ones, the same symbols that had appeared in the ruins of forgotten civilizations. His heart pounded as he traced the markings with his eyes, the weight of something ancient pressing upon him. This was no ordinary manuscript. It was a key, a message left behind by those who had come before him, a warning or a summons he could not yet tell. As he read further, the text spoke of a place, a location that had been lost to time, a sanctuary where the old ones had once dwelled. It described a ritual, an invocation that had been used to summon them, to open the door between the known and the unknowable. Varn's breath caught in his throat as he realized the implications. This was not merely an account of the past. It was a guide, a blueprint for something that had been deliberately hidden. He had thought he was searching for knowledge, but now he understood that he had been drawn here for a reason. The old ones had not been forgotten. They had been waiting. A cold dread settled over him as he turned the pages, the words growing more cryptic, more ominous. The text spoke of a convergence, a moment when the veil between worlds would thin once more, when the old ones would return, and at the heart of it all was a name, one that sent a shiver through him. The name of the cult that had once worshipped the old ones, the same cult that had vanished without a trace. He had read of them before, but now, with the text in his hands, he felt the weight of their presence pressing upon him. They had not disappeared. They had been waiting, just as he had been. Varn's hands clenched into fists as he stared at the manuscript, his mind racing with the implications. He had come seeking knowledge, but now he understood that he had stumbled upon something far more dangerous. The old ones were not merely myths. They were real, and they had not been forgotten. They had been waiting for him to find this text, to uncover the truth. And as he stood in the dimly lit attic, the shadows stretching around him, he could not shake the feeling that he had already stepped too far into the unknown. The encounter with the cult. The air in Elden Hollow had grown heavier, as though the very fabric of reality was being pulled taut. Varn had spent the night poring over the ancient text, his mind racing with the implications of what he had uncovered. He had been certain that he was alone, that the village had been abandoned for centuries. But as the first light of dawn crept through the cracked windows of the old house, he heard it, a whisper, soft and unintelligible, curling through the air like a breath from something unseen. He turned sharply, his heart pounding, but the house was silent. The only sound was the wind, howling through the narrow streets beyond the walls. He told himself it was merely his imagination, the result of too many sleepless nights and too much exposure to the unknown. But the feeling of being watched did not abate. It was not the presence of the old ones that unsettled him now, but something else, something closer, something human. The first sign of the cult came as he stepped outside, the morning mist clinging to the ground, like a veil drawn over the world. He had not expected to see anyone in Elden Hollow. But as he moved through the village, he noticed the faint outlines of figures in the fog. At first, they seemed to be nothing more than shadows, flickering between the buildings like phantoms. But then, as he drew closer, he saw them. Cloaked figures, their faces obscured by tattered hoods, their movements unnervingly synchronized. They did not walk, they glided, as if the ground itself resisted their presence. Varn froze, his breath catching in his throat. The cult had not vanished. They had been waiting for him, just as the old ones had. He had thought himself the only one who had come seeking the truth, but now he realized that he had been led here by forces beyond his understanding. His hands trembled as he reached for the ancient text, the weight of it in his grip. Ah! Reminder of the knowledge he had uncovered. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It was taller than the others, its cloak flowing like liquid shadow, its hood drawn low over a face that was obscured by the darkness within. Varn could not see its eyes, but he could feel them, watching him, waiting. The air around them seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though the very fabric of the world was shifting in response to their presence. Then the figure spoke. Its voice was a whisper, not from the mouth, but from the air itself, as if the words had been spoken by the wind and the earth. "You have come at last," it said, the words curling through the air like smoke. "The time is near. The old ones will. Return, and you will be there to witness it." Varn's breath came in shallow gasps. He had expected to be hunted, to be pursued by the cult, but instead they had welcomed him. He had thought himself an intruder, but now he understood that he had been summoned. The cult had been waiting for him, just as the old ones had. And as the figure's words echoed in his mind, he realized that he was no longer merely an observer. He was part of something far greater, something that had been waiting for him to find the truth. The awakening of the Old One. The cult moved with a singular purpose, their figures gliding through the village as though they were not bound by the same laws that governed the rest of the world. Varn stood at the center of it all, his mind a tempest of fear and fascination. He had come seeking knowledge, but now he was no longer an observer. He was a participant in something vast and unknowable. The cult had led him to the heart of Elden Hollow, to a place where the air was thick with an unnatural stillness, where the stars above seemed to pulse with a rhythm that was not their own. At the center of the village, nestled between two crumbling buildings, was an ancient structure that had been hidden for centuries. It was a temple, or perhaps a tomb, its walls covered in the same cryptic symbols that had been etched into the manuscript he had discovered. The cult gathered around it, their voices rising in a low, rhythmic chant, the sound reverberating through the air like the distant tolling of a bell. Varn could feel the ground beneath his feet trembling, as though the very earth was responding to the ritual. He had studied the Old Ones for years, had read of the cult that had worshipped them, had traced the echoes of their existence through the ruins of forgotten civilizations, but nothing in his research had prepared him for this. The air was thick with a presence that pressed against him, an overwhelming weight that made his breath come in shallow gasps. It was not fear, not exactly, but something deeper, an understanding that he was standing on the precipice of something beyond human comprehension. The cult's chant grew louder, the words no longer mere syllables, but something ancient and unfathomable, something that seemed to curl around his mind like a whisper from the void. Varn's hands trembled as he clutched the manuscript, the weight of it in his grip, a reminder of the knowledge he had uncovered. He had thought himself the one who had come seeking the truth, but now he realized that the truth had come to him. The ritual had begun. The cult moved in unison, their hands raised toward the temple, their voices merging into a single, overwhelming force. The symbols on the walls pulsed with a strange, shifting light, as though they were alive, as though they were alive, as though they were responding to the invocation. Varn's vision blurred, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. He could feel the presence of the Old One growing stronger, pressing against the edges of his thoughts, filling the air with a sense of something vast and unknowable. Then the sky above them darkened. The stars that had once gleamed in the night sky were now obscured, swallowed by an unnatural darkness that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. The wind howled, no longer a mere whisper, but a force that tore through the village with a ferocity that sent the trees swaying in violent, unnatural arcs. The ground beneath Varn's feet trembled violently, as though the very fabric of the world was being pulled apart. A deep, resonant sound filled the air, a sound that was not made by any earthly instrument, but something far older, something that had existed before the first stars had burned. It was the voice of the Old One, and it was calling. The cult fell to their knees, their faces bathed in the strange, shifting light that emanated from the temple. Varn could feel the entity's presence pressing against him, an overwhelming force that threatened to consume him entirely. He tried to move, to run, but his body was frozen in place. The ritual had reached its climax, and the Old One was awakening. The air around him grew heavier, the weight of something vast and unknowable pressing against his mind. He could feel the entity's presence growing stronger, its form taking shape in the darkness, a vast, incomprehensible thing that defied all human understanding. And then, with a single, resonant pulse, the Old One emerged. The world shattered around him, the sky splitting open as the entity's form took shape, a being of impossible proportions that defied the very laws of existence. Varn could not look away, could not move, could not even breathe, as the Old One's presence filled the air, pressing against him with an overwhelming force that threatened to consume him entirely. The ritual was complete. The Old One had returned, the unfathomable presence. The unfathomable presence, the entity emerged from the darkness like a nightmare given form, its presence suffocating the very air around it. Varn could not look away, his eyes locked onto the monstrosity that had taken shape before him. It was not a creature in the way that men understood life. It was something beyond biology, beyond the constraints of the physical world. Its form was vast, impossibly large, as though it existed in a dimension that defied the limitations of space. It was not merely a being. It was an absence, a void that swallowed the light and consumed the very fabric of reality itself. The entity's body was an amalgamation of impossible shapes, a shifting mass of tentacles, limbs, and eyes that did not blink but stared with an unrelenting, knowing gaze. Its skin, if it could be called that, was a swirling mass of ink and shadow, a surface that seemed to pulse with an inner darkness as though it were a living thing that had been pulled from the abyss of the cosmos. Its face, if it had one, was a grotesque fusion of features that could not belong to any known species. It had no mouth, yet its presence was filled with a soundless scream, a voice that resonated in the depths of Varn's mind, speaking in a language that was not words, but something far older, something that bypassed thought and reached directly into the soul. Varn's breath came in shallow gasps, his body frozen in place as the entity's presence pressed against him. It was not merely a being of immense size, it was a force, a presence that defied the very concept of existence. The air around it was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though time itself had been suspended. He could feel the weight of its gaze upon him, an overwhelming sense of being watched, of being observed by something that had no need for eyes. It was as if the entity did not see him, but rather it was aware of him in a way that no human could ever comprehend. The ground beneath him trembled, not from the ritual, but from the sheer force of the entity's presence. The stars above had vanished, replaced by an endless void that stretched beyond the horizon, an abyss that seemed to stretch into eternity. Varn could feel the entity's power pressing against him, a force that was not merely physical, but something deeper, something that reached into the very core of his being. It was not just the presence of the Old One, it was the presence of something that had existed before the first stars had burned, before the first men had walked upon the earth. A wave of nausea overtook him, his body convulsing as the entity's presence filled the air. He could feel it in his bones, in his mind, in every fiber of his being. It was not merely a being of immense size and power, it was a force that defied all comprehension, a thing that had no need for form, that had no need for language, that had no need for anything but existence itself. It was not evil, not the way that men understood such things, but it was something far worse. It was something that did not care for the lives of men, something that had no concept of morality, of right or wrong, of time or space. It was something that had existed beyond the veil of human understanding, and now it had returned. The cult had fallen to their knees, their faces bathed in the shifting light of the entity's presence. They were not in fear, not in awe, but in something else entirely. They were not worshippers. They were servants, bound to the entity in a way that defied all understanding. Varn could see the look in their eyes, the way they stared at the entity with a mixture of reverence and terror. They had not summoned it, they had merely opened the door, and now, the Old One had come. And now, the entity was looking at him. Varn could not move, could not speak, could not even think. The entity's presence was overwhelming, an unbearable weight that pressed against him, threatening to consume him entirely. He could feel it in his mind, in his soul, in every part of his being. It was not merely a presence. It was a force that had no need for words, that had no need for thought, that had no need for anything but existence itself. And then, with a single resonant pulse, the entity spoke. It was not a voice, not in the way that men understood sound. It was a feeling, a sensation that filled the air, that pressed against Varn's mind with an overwhelming force. It was not a message, not a warning, but something else entirely. It was a presence that reached into the very core of his being, that touched the deepest parts of his soul, that whispered something that he could not understand, but that he could not forget. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the entity was gone. The desperate escape. Varn's breath came in ragged gasps as he staggered back from the temple, his mind still reeling from the overwhelming presence of the Old One. The cult had fallen to their knees, their faces bathed in the shifting light of the entity's awakening. They were not in fear, not in awe, but in something else entirely. Submission. They had not summoned the Old One, they had merely opened the door, and now the entity had come. He had to leave. He had to get away before it was too late. His body trembled as he forced himself to move, his legs unsteady beneath him. The air around him was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the world itself had paused to witness the return of the Old One. He could not allow himself to be caught in the ritual's final moments, to be consumed by the entity's presence. He had to escape, even if it meant running blindly through the village, even if it meant facing the unknown. The cult had not moved. They remained kneeling before the temple, their faces upturned toward the entity, their bodies trembling as though they were not merely worshippers, but something else entirely, servants bound to the Old One in a way that defied all understanding. Varn could see the look in their eyes, the way. They stared at the entity with a mixture of reverence and terror. They had not been the ones to summon the Old One, they had merely been the ones to open the door. And now the entity had come. He turned, his mind racing, his thoughts a blur of fear and desperation. The village was still, the mist thick around him, the wind no longer howling but whispering in a language that was not his own. He had to find a way out, had to find the path that would lead him away from the temple, away from the entity, away from the cult. He could not allow himself to be consumed by the ritual's final act. His hands clenched into fists as he forced himself forward, his legs moving with a will of their own. He had come seeking knowledge, but now he understood that knowledge had come to him in a way he had never imagined. The Old One had returned, and now the world would never be the same. The sound of footsteps behind him sent a jolt of fear through his body. He turned sharply, his heart pounding in his chest. The cult was moving now, their figures rising from the ground, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity that sent a shiver through his spine. They were not coming to stop him. They were coming to ensure that he did not escape. He ran. The village blurred around him as he sprinted through the narrow streets, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The mist thickened, the air growing colder with every step he took. He could feel the entity's presence pressing against him, a force that threatened to consume him entirely. But he could not stop. He had to keep running, had to find a way out before the cult caught him. The Old One's presence was still with him, a weight that pressed against his mind, a whisper that curled through the air like smoke. He could not allow himself to be caught, could not allow himself to be consumed by the entity's power. He had come seeking knowledge, but now he understood that the knowledge had come at a cost. And as he ran, as the village blurred around him, he could not shake the feeling that the Old One was watching, waiting for him to return. The aftermath of the Old One's return. The village of Elden Hollow was no longer the same. The mist that had once clung to the ground like a veil now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though the very air had been altered by the presence of the Old One. The buildings, once crumbling and abandoned, now bore the marks of something far more sinister. The symbols that had been etched into the walls of the ancient temple had spread, curling like ink across the surfaces of the surrounding structures, their meaning lost to time, but their presence undeniable. The cult had vanished, leaving behind only the faint echoes of their chant, a sound that still lingered in the air like a whisper from the void. Varn stood at the edge of the village, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he stared at the ruins before him. The ritual had been completed. The Old One had returned, and the world had changed in ways that defied comprehension. He could still feel the entity's presence, pressing against the edges of his mind, a weight that threatened to consume him entirely. It was not merely a memory, not merely the lingering sensation of something vast and unknowable. It was a force that had been awakened, something that had been waiting for him to return. He had escaped, but at what cost? The village was still, the mist thick and unbroken, the wind no longer howling but whispering in a language that was not his own. He had come seeking knowledge, but now he understood that knowledge had come to him in a way he had never imagined. The Old One had returned, and now the world would never be the same. He could not shake the feeling that the entity was still watching, still waiting. The cult had vanished, but their presence had not been erased. They had been bound to the Old One, their devotion unwavering, their purpose fulfilled. And now, with the entity's return, the world had been changed in ways that could not be undone. The village was no longer a place of ruin, but a place of something far more terrible. The Old One had not merely returned, it had awakened, and with its return, the fabric of reality had been altered. The stars above were no longer the same, their light dimmed by an unseen force. The air was thick with a presence that could not be explained, a force that defied all human understanding. Varn turned away from the ruins, his mind still reeling from the knowledge he had uncovered. He had come seeking the truth, but now he understood that the truth had come to him in a way that could not be undone. The Old One had returned, and now the world would never be the same. And as he walked away from Elden Hollow, he could not shake the feeling that the entity was still watching, still waiting for him to return. The lingering shadow Varn had escaped Elden Hollow, but the village had not released him. The weight of the Old One's presence still clung to him, an invisible force pressing against the edges of his mind, whispering in a language that was not his own. The stars above no longer gleamed with the same brilliance, and the air felt heavier, as though the very fabric of reality had been altered by the entity's return. He had come seeking knowledge, but now he understood that knowledge had come to him in a way that could not be undone. The Old One had returned, and with its return the world had changed in ways that could not be measured or explained. He had thought himself an observer, a seeker of the truth, but now he realized that he had been a part of something far greater, something that had been waiting for him to return. The cult had vanished, but their devotion had not been in vain. They had opened the door, and the Old One had come. The ritual had been completed, and the entity had awakened. He had seen it, felt its presence pressing against him, had heard its voice in the depths of his mind, and now He could not escape the knowledge that it was still watching, still waiting. The world had not been destroyed, but it had been changed. The cult had vanished, but their influence remained. The symbols that had once been hidden in the forgotten corners of the village now spread outward, curling across the land like ink upon parchment. The Old One had not merely returned. It had awakened, and with its return, the veil between the known and the unknowable had been torn asunder. The stars above no longer burned with the same light, and the air was thick with the presence of something vast and unknowable. Varn had survived, but he would never be the same. He had seen the Old One, had felt its presence pressing against him, had heard its voice in the depths of his mind. And now he understood that the entity was not merely a being of the past. It was something that had always been, something that had existed beyond the veil of human understanding, waiting for the right moment to return. And now, with the ritual completed, the Old One had come. He could not return to the world he had known. The knowledge he had uncovered had changed him, had left a mark upon his soul that could not be erased. The Old One had awakened, and now the world would never be the same.